New Zealand is an island nation, rich in culture, biodiversity, and terrain. A popular tourist destination, it is one of the safest countries in the world and very protective of its environment and security. Here's the history of this beautiful, isolated nation. The Nation Parade presents The History of New Zealand. New Zealand is geographically isolated, deep in the South Pacific. Its two large islands, the North and South, are surrounded by numerous smaller islands. The largest cities are Auckland and the country's capital, Wellington, on the North Island, and Christchurch on the South Island. English and the native tongue of Māori are the official languages. A former British colony, New Zealand became an independent dominion in 1907. The first arrivals to New Zealand were Polynesians. They likely came from the Marquesas or Society Islands, or Cook Islands. These mariners did not arrive until the centuries around 1000 AD. That makes New Zealand the last major settlement in human history. The seashores and riverways of the North Island were settled first. Over time, the arrivals spread across both main islands. They developed a culture unique from other Polynesians. They named their home Aotearoa, or Land of the Long White Cloud. The islands lay isolated and undisturbed by foreigners for centuries. Though they had no outside enemies, the natives did experience tribal conflicts. The first European to arrive was Abel Tasman, an explorer for the Dutch East India Company. In 1642, Tasman spotted a large landmass with high mountains. While moored near the shore, his crew had a bloody encounter with the natives. 4 crew members were killed, and Tasman retreated without landing. He mapped a portion of the coast, referring to the site as Statenland. A cartographer later renamed it Nova Zeelandia, or New Zealand, after the Dutch province of Zeeland. Because Tasman had not located any mineral wealth or usable land, the Dutch East India Company lost interest in his discovery. 120 years would pass before the outside world visited the islands again. James Cook was a lieutenant in the British Navy and an experienced explorer. His government assigned him to conduct scientific observations in the Pacific Islands. A second, secret assignment was to search for the island Tasman had found more than a century earlier. Like other European governments, the British dreamed of discovering another massive continent, a great, unknown southern land with resources to exploit. Cook set sail from England in 1768. After a year of travel, including several months in Tahiti, he turned south. On October 6, 1769, a cabin boy sighted land. Cook came ashore 2 days later. During the next few months, Cook circumnavigated and mapped the coastlines of both islands. Cook returned to New Zealand twice more. After Cook's visits, New Zealand became a target for colonization. The first European residents were primarily seal hunters, whalers, traders, and missionaries. Explorers also used New Zealand as a jumping-off point for expeditions to the South Pacific. European diseases came with the colonizers, striking down large numbers of the native population. But the viruses that caused the most devastating diseases, such as smallpox, could not survive the long sea journey. For this reason, the New Zealand natives did not experience the near annihilation faced by other native groups around the world during the colonial age. The indigenous people called themselves Tangata Whenua, or the people of the land. They became known as Māori, which was their native word for normal. They used the word Pākehā to refer to non-Maori white people. The Maori found employment on whalers and trading ships. They visited nearby countries like Australia and Tasmania. There, the Maori saw the nightmarish abuses inflicted on natives by the white colonists. Like the Australian Aborigines, New Zealand's natives were warriors. They actively fought against intrusion and abuse. Muskets were introduced to help the Maori defend themselves against outside threats. For example, the French were aggressively seeking to disrupt Britain's growing influence in the region. But the muskets proved a disastrous addition to intertribal conflicts. Arguments were soon settled by gunfire. The Musket Wars of the early 1800s were a catastrophe for the natives. Thousands of Maori were slaughtered by other tribes. Many abandoned their homes to flee the violence. With no one defending these tribal lands, European settlers moved in. Tobacco and liquor also proved devastating to the natives. The Maori were one of the few native cultures that had never developed alcohol. It was poorly received at first. By the mid-1800s, alcoholism was a major problem. Tobacco use spread quickly among the Maori, along with its negative health effects. Britain's political and humanitarian leaders debated how to bring order to the islands. They wanted to maintain British interests and investments, but also protect the Maori from outsiders and each other. They decided to make New Zealand a British colony. The instrument for this was the Treaty of Waitangi. A surprisingly short document, put together in a week, the treaty was signed by 52 Maori chiefs on February 6, 1840. From there, it circulated through the islands until 532 Maori chiefs had signed it, about half of those eligible. The terms of the treaty were set by the island's soon-to-be colonial governor. The Maori received the benefits of British citizenship in exchange for rights over Maori land and fishing resources. However, the Maori translation of the treaty failed to capture the true nature of what the natives were agreeing to. Here are two examples. First, the Maori held a different concept of land ownership. For them, it was more of a community-minded stewardship that was temporary as generations passed. European colonists, however, purchased land for their exclusive permanent use. Second, the Maori view of governorship differed significantly from the British intent of sovereignty. This distinction was not clear in the treaty's Maori translation. The region's seal population was wiped out by the 1830s. The whaling industry fell off a decade later. Overfishing had practically eliminated whales from the region. Whaling continued farther afield, but was not a reliable industry for New Zealand. Then, in the mid-1800s, a new animal found a market in the islands. Introduced in 1814 to feed whalers, sheep adapted well to the rough, hilly terrain. By 1860, the wool industry generated the greatest part of New Zealand's export earnings. In the 1840s, investors in London conceived of a new business venture, now that the islands had become an official, self-governing British colony. The New Zealand Company sought to create a model English settlement. The plan was to transplant British culture and civilization directly into this new Eden-like land. This idealistic settlement would avoid the traditional class struggles of Britain and reap a good profit for the developers. The marketing was all based on reputation, since the company's owners had never actually been to the islands. But they sold off parcels of land to colonists who had not yet left England. The investment plan and the company collapsed when the immigrant investors arrived in New Zealand. They expected established communities. They expected virgin pasture lands of productive soil ready for farming. Instead, they found untamed, infertile wildland. And some of that land was claimed by the Maori, who were living on it. Unable to achieve their agricultural goals, many of these immigrants moved to urban centers that the New Zealand Company had established. The immigrants from Britain had to travel a great distance to reach New Zealand. This meant they tended to be young, vigorous, self-reliant, and committed. They included young married couples and entire families. Many had expected to create an ideal society, as promoted by the New Zealand Company. This mindset would resonate across the islands. Nearly 10,000 settlers arrived during the 1840s. This surge in population contributed to a major demographic shift. By the 1850s, the Maori had become the minority population in their own land. The failings of the Treaty of Waitangi became apparent quickly. For example, the Maori could sell land only to the British government, not to incoming settlers. But the government then sold that land to investors or settlers for a huge profit. Plus, the right to vote and participate in politics was based on property ownership. This disqualified most Maori because of their communal style of land stewardship. Finding themselves excluded from government as foreigners occupied their lands, the Maori organized themselves politically. They demanded to share power with the white settlers in making decisions about their own people, land, and resources. The so-called King movement, or Kingitanga, was framed as a kind of representational organization with a single Maori king. The idea was to provide a political structure that could engage with the colonial government. But the British saw it as a direct challenge to their colonial rule. The British government committed one provocation after another, trespassing on Maori land and firing on natives who resisted. With no political recourse, the Maori turned to violence to protect their interests, even though it was against overwhelming military superiority. The Maori Wars of United Resistance lasted for decades. The power struggle was amped up when gold was discovered during the 1860s. A surge of gold seekers from Australia and the American West rapidly increased the population of single males and created pockets of frontier chaos. European business interests encouraged conflict in the hope of obtaining fertile lands lost or abandoned by Maori tribes. In 1863, the New Zealand Settlements Act provided for the mass confiscation of land to establish colonial settlements. More than 1 million acres of Maori land were taken by the colonial British government. 2 years later, the Native Land Court used legal pretense to overrule the authority of the Maori chiefs and seize more land. By the 1880s, Britain's superior weaponry and professional army had prevailed. Legislative rules and legal proceedings against the so-called Maori rebels had eliminated most of their rights to quality land. Millions more acres were transferred from the Maori to the settlers. The defeated tribes were left impoverished on isolated reservations of land that was not suitable for farming. Resistors were imprisoned without trial for years. This allowed even more land to be confiscated in their absence. With the Maori subdued, New Zealand focused great effort on expanding the nation's economic opportunity. Almost all lowland forests were cut down and replaced with farms. British animals and plants were imported, devastating native species. The introduction of refrigerated shipping in the 1880s opened new markets for the island's mutton and dairy products. The nation had a growing Asian population, thanks in part to the gold rush. This did not cause much concern until the rise of Japanese imperialism at the start of the 20th century. The isolation of New Zealand and Australia from Mother England was seen in a new light. They looked more readily to Britain as a protector. They also began to look to the United States as a partner in defense against Asian encroachment. As the 20th century dawned, New Zealand became a self-governing dominion of the British Empire. And for the first time since the Pākehā arrived, the Maori population stabilized and began to grow. The World War years were surprisingly devastating to New Zealand, considering the country itself never hosted a battle. During World War I, tens of thousands of New Zealanders, Pākehā and Maori alike, enlisted and shipped out to defend the British Empire. Military debacles such as Gallipoli and Passchendaele contributed to an appalling casualty rate among the New Zealanders. 17,000 soldiers died, and 41,000 were wounded. The flu pandemic of 1918 killed thousands more. After the Great War, the Great Depression wreaked havoc on the nation. The traditional export markets had no money for buying New Zealand's goods. The Maori, already at the lowest economic level, lost their manual labor jobs. These were taken by white upper-level professionals who had lost jobs. The dire economic circumstances drove the nation's political ideology to the left. Campaign promises of greater independence, free education, and free medical services won over the electorate. After the Labour Party took office, voters saw significant improvements in healthcare and education. But this was paired with a 100% increase in income tax in a single year. Essentially, they developed a cradle-to-grave welfare state. The government sought to provide citizens the tax-funded standard of living, quote, that they ought to have, close quote. This included unemployment benefits, home ownership, free education, and widespread medical care. War returned to Europe in 1939. New Zealanders were not enthusiastic about sending another generation of young men off to foreign battlegrounds, but the imminent threat of Imperial Japan necessitated military cooperation with Mother England and her allies. Around 200,000 New Zealanders served in the military during World War II, including 10,000 women. At first, the military was dedicated to protecting Britain from Germany. Pākehā and Maori units fought in North Africa, Greece, and Italy, suffering horrific losses. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and its successful invasions of Singapore and the Pacific Islands changed the situation. The United States was given responsibility for protecting New Zealand, while New Zealand's troops were fighting in Europe. As the war progressed, New Zealand shifted its focus to supporting the U.S. campaign in the Pacific Theater. A post-war financial boon was funded in part by high demand for New Zealand wool. The economic benefits reached the entire country, including the Maori. This prosperity challenged the Labour Party's welfare state. Citizens rejected price and wage controls, and Cold War-era fear of communism fractured labor unions across the country. Because of its divided allegiance during World War II, New Zealand found itself dealing with two overlords, the fading British Empire and the United States, who controlled the Pacific. New Zealand, Australia, and the Polynesian islands of the South Pacific also found themselves surrounded by another unwanted leftover of the war. Britain, France, the United States, and other nations detonated more than 300 nuclear tests throughout the Pacific in the years following the war. During the 1960s and 70s, the country's export markets expanded. New Zealand pursued greater self-sufficiency in energy and manufacturing. The nation saw growing resistance to the Vietnam War and to nuclear testing. Opposition to multinational mining companies damaging the local environment coincided with the rise of environmentalism worldwide. Starting in the 1970s, the government passed laws to create a nuclear-free New Zealand. This not only forbade nuclear tests and nuclear power plants, but also visits by nuclear-armed or nuclear-powered naval ships, even if they were from allied countries. This disrupted relationships with the United States. The social unrest of the counterculture era brought positive change for the Maori. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established to settle land disputes dating back to the 1840 treaty. It also fought Pākehā efforts to take more tribal land and trivialized the treaty as a useless historical artifact. The tribunal grew in power during the following decades and began securing judgments in favor of the Maori by the mid-1990s. For example, the Tainui settlement of 1995 provided $170 million as compensation for past grievances. An independent Congress of Maori tribes was created to act as a pressure group on government. The dismantling of the New Zealand welfare state began in the 1980s. The government pursued a new financial approach, switching from being one of the most regulated to one of the freest economies in the world. The nation ended freezes on interest rates, prices, and wages, and curtailed government programs. As a result, the next decade saw significant increases in inflation, education costs, unemployment, private debt, the wage gap, crime rates, and interest rates. But public debt dropped to the point that the government actually began to see a budget surplus. Then, around the turn of the millennium, the country's political will swung to the center, bringing some economic and social stability. New Zealand expanded its export market beyond Australia, Britain, and the United States. They developed better market relations with the European Union, Japan, and wider Asia. New Zealand still faces economic risk because it depends on fickle industries like tourism and agricultural products. For example, the nation's isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic produced a 12.2% drop in gross domestic product in a single quarter. As a people, the Maori are flourishing, reaching 1 million in population for the first time. While many challenges exist, social and political, they are seeing improvements in life expectancy and economic status. For more information about New Zealand, check the credits for a list of resources. Check out our other shorter videos about New Zealand. They cover nuclear-free New Zealand, Gallipoli, and more. If you found this video helpful and informative, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the Nation Parade to make your world a little bigger.